Today's daf we're going to be learning together is Chullin Daf Gimel. Today's daf is sponsored for the refuah shlema of Iyar ben Chava, who is injured in Lebanon. Okay, we're going to get started with a quick review of yesterday's daf. So we saw a very confusing Mishna, a Mishna which is going to cause us a lot of 6 different interpretations of how to read this Mishna. That's going to be the main goal of today, to get through. What we're going to do is, number 1, get through all 6 interpretations, which one of them we saw yesterday, another 5 today. And then we're going to analyze, which the Gemara likes to do, why didn't this one hold by that one? And why did each one come up with a different interpretation? What were the weaknesses in each of the other positions? Okay, which is a classic style, and it actually reflects, we always like to talk about this, if there was one easy answer, right, it would be clear and everyone would agree. But obviously these are texts that were very unclear, and because of that, each one came up with an interpretation, but it doesn't mean that there aren't weaknesses in each one of them. And we're going to highlight all the weaknesses in all the commentaries. So what we saw yesterday was Raba bar Ulla. Well, let's talk about the basic problem in the Mishnah. There's 2 main problems, but one is really more basic than the other, which is hakol shulchatin. And then it says ushritatan kshira. Kol shulchatin means ideally everyone can slaughter. And then it said, but actually if they do, their shchita is okay, it works, but it sounds like it's not ideal. So how does it on the one hand sound like everyone can do it, and then sound like, well, only in a less ideal manner, right? Only if they already did it do we accept it, and those languages don't match. Then, once we get through that and resolve whatever way we resolve it, we're going to raise the question of the kulan sheshachatu shchitatan, right? If Yisrael omeid al gabehem, it works, right? Where the Mishna said, after it said, it said, other than a cheresh katan, who we don't accept them because Shemi Kalkalu, maybe they'll ruin the shchita. And then they said, but all these people, if they slaughter and there's acherim ro'inotan, someone else is watching them, then and saw that it was done well, then shchitatan kshera. Now the obvious is that that's referring to all of them, is referring to the cheresh katan. The problem is that it should then say, and if they slaughtered, and not all of them. All of them sounds like we're talking about a bigger group than just the cheresh katan. If it was just referring to the last line, it would have had a much easier transition. And if they slaughter, well, as long as someone was watching, we're going to accept their shchita. So we're going to, once we interpret the first phrase, we're going to then raise a difficulty on the next phrase. Now with Raba bar Ulla, the way we explained it was, and it was a bit complicated because the first line, the first phrase, and the second phrase are actually referring to completely different cases. Well, they're both talking about a tamei person, but the first is hakol shulchatin, is a tamei person who's slaughtering chulin that were treated as if they were kodesh. All these people, right, even though they didn't need to treat it, wasn't truma or something sanctified, they treated it as if it was sanctified. So we're going to say, if you're tamei, well, lechatchila, you can slaughter, because as long as you take a long knife, we're not really worried you're going to touch it, because even if you do, what's the worst case? It's chulin anyway. The next line of b'diavad is tamei, is tamei b'mukdashim, if it's sanctified items. Now we had a slew of questions on that. The first question was, first we just said tamei b'chulin, and then we said, well, what are you trying to teach us? And then they had to explain it was chulin shenishchatu al taharat hakodesh. Then we asked the question actually about, well, how do you deal with the kulan sheshachatu? And that we explained, well, it's b'mukdashim when the person wasn't there to ask the question. Then we asked, tamei b'mukdashim, but we don't learn tamei b'mukdashim from here. We learn it from in kachim, in zvachim. So why do we need it here and there? And then we gave 2 possible interpretations. Either here's the main, and that's just mentioned because it was mentioning other people, or there's the main place, and here it was mentioning it because it mentioned chulin, so it mentioned mukdashim. Okay? We kind of answered that. Now we're up to the last question, which is, Hai tamei di tamei b'mai. What was the person tamei from? So if you assume, which we thought, ilema di tamei b'meit, okay, I'm starting again from the bottom of ben amabed, even though we did this. B'chalal cherev amar Rachmana. Cherev areu kechalal, avatumihi. Li tamei l'sakim, v'az l'sakim, v'tamite l'basal. If the person was tamei meit, and they take a knife, and they slaughter the animal, what's the problem? A knife that touches either a dead body, takes upon the status of the dead body, special halacha, based on this pasuk in the Torah, and therefore they say a cherev is like a halal. And so now they're going to say either it touched, okay, here we're talking about it touched, it's the person who must be a tamei mate. They're not dead. They're slaughtering. So they must be tamei mate. They're the tamei. And they take the knife. Now, when they are tamei and they take the knife, the knife takes on the status of the person slaughtering. So what's the problem? The knife is going to be an avatuma. Avatuma is now going to touch meat and turn it into a rishon. And then it doesn't matter whether the person touches the meat or not. That was the whole thing. If you use a long knife, well, you won't touch the meat and you'll be okay. But, or in the mukdashim case, where as long as you say, I know I didn't touch it, then we'll accept it b'diavad, post facto. But it doesn't make a difference whether you touched it or not, because as soon as you touch the knife, which obviously you're holding the knife, you're touching the knife is then going to make the meat tamei. That's laws of tumah. Avatuma passes on impurity to the meat. Okay, so we're going to have two interpretations to this. Either we're going to leave tumat mate and say eladi tamei b'sheretz. One of the shretzim, right, which is one of these 8 creepy crawly creatures, which if they're dead and they touch a person, they're going to make the person into a rishon. Now, if the person's a rishon, the only thing they can be tamei is food and drink. They can't pass on impurity to vessels. So that's just rules of impurity. So if they were tamei b'sheretz and they touch the knife, they're not going to make the knife impure because the knife is a vessel. It's not going to be impure because you can't pass on impurity to a vessel if you're only a rishon. But what's the concern then? Maybe they'll touch the meat, and then that fits perfectly. Or, ibait ema, second alternative is, literally the words ibait ema means if you want, you can say, which means let's suggest something else. Lo lamdi tamei b'meit. Okay, what happened to the halal hareu kecherev? Cherev hareu kechalal. The sword is like the dead body. Well, kegon shebadak krumit shel kaneh v'shachat ba. You took a reed, okay, and you used it to slaughter the animal. Now we're going to learn, Titania, bakol shochatim bein betzor bein b'schuchi bein krumit shel kaneh. You don't have to use a knife to slaughter. You can use a stone, sharpened stone, a piece of glass, or this part of a reed. Now, none of these, actually, the Gemara could have suggested any one of the 3. There's actually a question why the Gemara doesn't, but that's a side question the commentaries ask. But the main thing here is, let's take the case of the reed. If you take a sharpened reed, now, in order for this law, there's actually a 3-way machloket about cherev hareu kechalal, what determines what a cherev is. Now, either interpretation, the reed is not going to be included in here, because either it's just something that's like a knife or a sword, like a metal implement that's sharp that can kill, and that's a reed is not metal implement that can kill, or it could be anything metal, or it could be anything that's a vessel. Anyway, that's not a vessel, okay? If it's a reed is not considered a vessel, whereas a knife is considered a vessel. So either which way, the law of cherev hareu kechalal is not applicable in that case. And then you would have a solution, because then the impurity wouldn't pass on to the reed, and the only concern would be that the person would touch the meat. So with that, we finish Raba bar Ulla, and now we're going to move on to our next interpretation. So now I'm going to start sharing my screen, and we're going to look, actually, the question and answer that we just did was also on the study guide, but didn't share my screen, but you can look back there. Now, so Raba bar Ulla we have here, remember, hakol shochatin is tameh with a chulin shenasu al tarat kodesh. It's not really hekdesh stuff. Right, it's only someone's treating it like it's kodesh, and that lechatchila you can do. Shchitatan kshera is b'diavad if it's mukdashim, and the person said, "I know that I didn't touch it," then it's okay. Chutz v'chereshot have a katan, because maybe they'll just do it wrong. That's a whole different issue. Shemi yeshu, shemi yidrasu, shemi yachlidu, and the kulan sheshachatu. In the end, we're going to explain. It's not talking about the chereshot have a katan. It's talking about, this is all review of yesterday. It's talking about a tameh with mukdashim. And they're just not there for us to ask them. So since they're not there, as long as someone watched the shechita, we can rely on that. So basically we end up with 2 ways the shechita of a tamei person, if it's sanctified, we're going to accept their shechita, and that's either they say, I know I didn't touch it, or someone was watching them, and then we know they didn't touch it. Okay, Abaye. Abaye amar hachi katani. This is the way to read it. Hakol shachatin va'afilu kuti. Okay, even a kuti. Who's a kuti? The kuti are the shomronim. These are people, not apropos, by the way, on Friday, when was it? Friday was Pesach Sheni, and the shomronim did their zevach ha-shomronim. A friend of mine went. We've talked about it before. It's something to watch. Anyway, the Shomronim were people that when the Assyrians came, they moved everybody around, and they were the people who ended up in Israel when they moved out the people from Shomron, the Malchut Yisrael, the whole Israelite kingdom was exiled. So they brought people to live here. Lions started attacking them. They, according to Sefer Malachim, they found a Kohen. The Kohen taught them the rules of the land, and they became Jews. There's a big debate in the Gemara about whether these are Gerei Emet or Gerei Arayot. Are they real, true converts, which means we treat them as Jews, or were they converted out of fear? And people who convert out of fear, that's not a legitimate conversion, and they're not really considered Jews in any way. So this opinion of Abai and Rava after him, we're going to see, both treat a Kuti as a Jew. Real converts. It's just that they weren't so reliable about knowing all the details, okay? As a group, this isn't saying that converts aren't reliable. Converts are reliable in general. We can trust that they know the laws. But as a group of people, since they converted as a whole group, they weren't so trusted. They were known that Kutim, the way we have like Amei Haaretz, that we say those people aren't careful about certain things, the Kutim were known not to be so careful about knowing all sorts of things. So the way we read it is like this. Hakosho chatina filu kuti. We can accept a kuti, even a kuti can do it. Bamid dvarim amurim, they can shecht, but when? Kishi Yisrael omed al gabav. Okay, now this whole thing about achir ru'inoto at the end of the Mishnah, we're now sticking in the beginning of the Mishnah. And that's going to create a problem with the end of the Mishnah, because then what's the end of the Mishnah add? So now we're going to say like this. The kuti is accepted as long as a Jew is watching and saw they did the shechita properly. Otherwise, we don't rely on the kuti. Okay. Aval yotze v'nichnas lo yishchot. Now, if you know anything about laws of mashgiachs, okay, when you have a mashgiach in a restaurant, what happens? Generally, they don't stay there the whole time. They come and go. Okay? Now, usually coming and going is enough. But Abaye says it's not going to work here for the shechita of a kuti. If the Jew is yotze v'nichnas and watched a little bit of the slaughter, didn't watch the whole thing, or he's slaughtering a bunch of animals and was there for part of it, not for the whole time, so we're not going to rely on it. However, if, okay, now we got to get to how he explains the shechita tok sherakes. Ve'im shachat, if he did it anyway, and the Yisrael was yotze v'nichnas, came in and out, chotech kezayit basar v'noten lo, is an interesting way to test him. Now, the kuti, maybe we're not sure they know all the laws of shechita and know how to slaughter properly. However, we know that they're not going to eat non-kosher meat. So therefore, if they're not going to eat non-kosher meat, what are we going to say? What's the test? If people weren't watching him the whole time, chotech kezayit basar. We cut off a piece of the meat. Okay, this is like if you're worried someone's poisoning you, what are you going to do? Say, you eat it first, okay? Or you're not sure the food is good. Say, okay, you made it. You eat it, then let us know. Okay, or let's say a more realistic case, right? You think the food is spoiled. You'd rather someone else taste it than you. Okay, but that's a little different. This is more like, if you made it, you test it. So we slice a piece of meat, and we give it to him. Now, achalo, if he eats it, mutar lecho b'shchitato. We assume he did a kosher shchita because he's not going to eat it, right? Imagine you decided that you were going to slaughter, like have fun, and let's try slaughtering. You wouldn't eat it if you weren't sure you did it right. That's basically what we're going to assume about the kuti. So while the kuti might not know all the rules and everything else, on the other hand, they're not. It's like this: kutim as a group don't know all the rules. But if a kuti is willing to rely on his own slaughter, we're going to assume the kuti wouldn't eat non-kosher meat. So that's enough of a test for us, and that's the b'di'evet shechita tok shera. If he already did it, people weren't watching the whole time, but the kuti is willing to eat it, then b'di'evet we can eat it. Lo achalo, however, obviously, if he's not willing to eat it, asur lecho mishchitato. Okay, then you can't eat from his meat. Now let's keep going in the Mishnah. Chutz mecheresh shotev katan, da'afilu di'evet nami lo. Right, even b'di'evet you can't eat from their shchita. Why? Shemi yeshu, shemi yidrusu, shemi yachlidu. Right, since they're not of sound knowledge, they don't have enough knowledge about things, they don't have real understanding. So we're going to basically say, and this is going to be the same refrain for all the cases, as you can see in the chart, that because of all these concerns, maybe they'll wait in between. Maybe they'll, chop it instead of going with this back and forth motion, or maybe they'll put the knife inside under the simanim and cut it like that, which are all disqualified. We don't allow them to do shchita. V'kulan sheshachatu ahaya. Now, what about the last line in the Mishnah? If they did it, As long as someone was watching them, we're going to accept it. So again, we're going to say this every single time we get to it. If you think it's talking about the chereshot and katan, alakai, well then it's just referring to the previous sentence. And if it's referring to the previous sentence, the language of the kulan and all of these people doesn't make any sense. V'im shachatom mibayale, it should have said, and if they do slaughter and someone was watching them, we'll accept their shechita. So it must be ela kuti, must be referring to the kuti, back to the first case. But what's the problem? Ha'amalt, we already said in the first part, Kish Yisrael omed al gabav shachet afilu lechatchila. We said that, forget about, right? Remember, this last line says, if they did it already and someone was watching, we can post facto accept it. But Abaye already explained the first line to say, the kuti, as long as someone's watching him, he can do it lechatchila, ab initio. He can start out and do it. So you can't explain the last line like that, in which case we're going to end in a kasha. This is actually difficult, according to Abaye. We don't have a good way to explain this line. Okay, you can already see that when we're going to come back to this later, and I already told you that we're going to say, why didn't people hold like the other one's opinions? Obviously, they didn't hold like Abaye because he couldn't explain the last line. Right? It's a big weakness in his approach. Okay, but he won't be alone in this weakness because the next two are going to have the same weakness. Okay, we're going to see that these three, Abaye, Rava, and Ravashi, that we're going to see now, all are similar in a particular way and different from the other three that we're going to see, the Raba bar Ulla that we saw, and the other ones, because they're all going to be talking about a certain person who's not reliable in general, as opposed to before, Raba bar Ulla was a tameh, it was someone who happened to be impure at the time, okay, but it wasn't a weakness in him in general, it wasn't like a category of people. Here we're going to have different categories of people who are not trusted, okay, so Rava is going to continue with Abaye. So first we're going to have a difficulty of Rava on Abaye. Rava is going to raise a difficulty, and then he's going to modify Abaye's shita. Okay, modify Abaye's opinion and give a bit of a different version. So here are Rava's questions. I'm a Rava. Okay, and if you want to look on the sheet, it's on the second page. Okay, because I had to fit the chart on the first page, so the difficulty that Rava raises is on the second page of the study guide. I'm a Rava. Now we talked about mashgichim. Mashgichim, it works when they come and go. Okay. Now Rava here said it doesn't. Abaye said it doesn't work ab initio, right? It only works post facto, and only if you have the kuti eat the food, right? Even that's not enough. Okay, Yotzei v'nechnas doesn't really work. Now Rava wants to question that and say, why doesn't Yotzei v'nechnas work lechatchila? He says Yotzei v'nechnas lechatchila lo. You don't think that's fine ab initio? Should be totally fine, just like mashgichim. And what's our source for this? Our source is a Mishna in Avodah Zarah. The Hatnan, if I have a store with barrels of wine, now remember, wine is the big issue, Yeh Nesech, if a Gentile touches my wine, he can ruin it. So I have a store. Haminiach Nochli, or Ovei Kochavim, depends on your version, mine says Nochli, you have a non-Jew who you leave Bechanuto in your store. Okay, I go out of my store and I leave a non-Jew in the store. Yisrael Yotzei v'Nichnas, and I come and go. Okay, but maybe I have a person who works in my store, that's a non-Jew, and I leave them there, but I'm always coming and going, and I could come in at any moment. Mutal, okay, my wine is completely permitted. Okay, so what do you see? Sounds like ab initio, it's totally fine. Yotzei v'nichnas. So Abaye has an answer. He says, what are you talking about? Hatam, mikatani meniach, ha-meniach katani diavad. You completely misunderstood the Mishnah. Look at the language. Hameniach nochri b'chanuto v'Yisrael yotzei v'nichnas mutar. That's actually b'diavad language, because how does it read? If hameniach is one who left a Gentile in their store, and the Jew came and went, as long as they were coming and going, it would be permitted. But that's b'diavad. If it wanted to say lechatchila, you can do it. What would it have said? It would say meniach nochri b'chanuto. Leave a non-Jew in your store, and as long as you come and go, it's fine. So that would be a lechatchila language. This one letter of hey changes everything. Hameniach means one who left a Gentile in their store. If they came and if they were coming and going, the Jew, then it would be permitted. That's a b'diavad, post facto language. So Abaye says, don't question me from that. That fits perfectly with what I said. But now Rava comes with the real knockout, and he says, okay, fine. You think that language sounds like b'diavad? I'm going to prove to you it's not, because look at the continuation of the Mishnah. Ela mehacha, learn it from here. Ein hashomer tzarich liot yoshev u'mishamel. The person watching, the non-Jew, doesn't have to be sitting and watching the whole time. This is clearly lechatchila language ab initio. Ela af al pi sheyotzev v'nichnas mutal. Okay, even if they come and go, it's completely permitted. Okay, because it says you don't need to sit and watch all the time, meaning ideally you don't need to be there all the time. It's enough to go in and out. So Rava says, I disagree with you completely. It can't be that only b'di'evet it's okay if they're coming and going. Okay, then the b'di'evet it's only going to be okay if the kuti actually eats it, right? Because it seems like even ab initio, as long as the Jew is coming and going, we can completely rely on the fact. Now, you could say maybe shechita is different than yenesech, okay, but there's no real reason to make a distinction. And therefore, Ella Amar Rava. So Rava, like I said, is going to do a different version of Abaye. Let's look at the chart again. So Rava comes and says, Hachi katane. This is how you should read it. Hakol shuchatin va'afilu kuti. So he goes along with Abaye. I'm going to go with you about this kuti. But bamed dvarim amurim, he's just going to change it minorly. Kishi Yisrael yotzev v'nichnas. Not if a Jew is standing there the whole time, but as Rava proved from the Mishna of Avodah Zarah, as long as the Jew is coming and going, that's sufficient. L'chatchila, in an ideal sense. Aval ba'u mitza'o shachat. But if, let's say, no Jew was watching, and then the Jew comes into the room, sees that the kuti slaughtered the animal, then what do? Same test as before. Chotech kazayat basal, we take a kazayat of meat, v'noten and we give it to him. Achalo mutar lecho mishchitato, lo achalo asur lecho mishchitato. As long as the kuti is willing to eat that kazayat, then we can trust it. Okay? Obviously, we're making a comparison between a non-Jew and a Jew, right? The kuti is a Jew, but again, the kuti is someone who is suspect that they don't really know the laws of shechita. So again, we're going to basically say, as long as the kuti will eat the meat, we assume he must have known the laws of shechita because he wouldn't do it without knowing that it was done properly. Okay, now we have to finish the rest of the Mishnah, which again, we're going to get stuck, the same problem we have for Abaye, which is chutz mecheresh shotev katan, de'afilu di'avenami lo, shem yeshu, shem yidresu, v'shem yachlidu, okay, cheresh shotev katan. Even post facto, we're not going to rely on their shechita because we're worried they made a mistake and they can't tell us and they don't know. V'kulan sheshachatu ahaya. But what's this then next phrase? V'kulan sheshachatu ahaya again means to what is it referring? Ilema chereshot v'katan alakai v'im shachato mebayale. Again, if it was talking about a chereshot v'katan, it would have said, and if they slaughtered, not kulan, all of them. Ela kuti. If you want to say it's talking about a kuti. We already said, right, if we say, as long as someone was watching the kuti, but you don't even need someone watching, and this is only post facto, we'll say it's good. The beginning, the way Rava understood the first line was that a kuti, as long as Yisrael is coming and going, in an ideal sense, we can have the kuti do the shechita. So that line completely makes no sense, in which case they say, you're right, kashya. Okay, we're left with a difficulty. Moving on to Rav Ashi. Now we come to opinion number 4. Rav Ashi Amar Hachikatani. Now he's a little similar, I said already, to Rav and Abai, who both think it's talking about a kuti. He is going to talk about what's called a mumar or a meshumad. Again, there's different versions. These are all because of the censorship. They changed the word ovei kochavim to nochli or vice versa. Okay, there's words that are going to appear in different ways. Because, right, sometimes it says goy, okay, there's all different words. Because of the censorship, they changed the words, and therefore we end up with different versions. Mumar or meshumad is basically a Jew who decides to not keep halacha. Okay, they either leave the religion entirely, or they just don't keep halacha. Okay, now there's 2 types of mumars or meshumads. Okay, one is someone who's ochel nevelo l'te'avon, which is they eat non-kosher meat because it's just cheaper, or they see it looks delicious, so they'll eat it. It's just easier, okay? But not because they don't really believe in Judaism, or they're what's called the mumar ochel nevelo lahachis. Lahachis is just so, because I want to show I'm eating non-kosher meat. I don't care about halacha at all. So there's 2 types of mumars. So the question is, which one are we talking about? So we're going to say it right now. Rav Ashi says, Hachi katani, al koshel chatin va'afilu Yisrael mumar. Even a Jew who doesn't really keep halacha can do shechita. Okay, this seems a little strange, but what we're going to say is like this. Mumar lemai, what kind of mumar are we talking about? Obviously, it's le'ochel nevelot le'te'avon, right? It's obviously the one who just does it the easier way. Now, we're going to basically assume that even though he takes the easy way out, if he's already going to slaughter, it takes a second to check your knife to make sure you do it right. So it's just as easy to do it in the permitted way than it is to do it in a non-permitted way. So he's obviously going to go the permitted path, because it's not like this person has a reason not to keep it. So we're assuming that it was done properly, okay? And therefore, uchide Rava, and this holds like Rava, okay? Pay attention. Rav Ashi is explaining this in the way of Rava, not the Rava that we saw by us. It's the same Rava, but by some other opinion Rava said, and he's basically connecting that opinion of Rava to the Mishnah. Okay. Later the Gemara is going to say, why didn't Rava himself say what Rava said? Okay, that's a little right. Why did he read the Mishnah that way? We'll get back to that at the end of the daf. Uchide Rava, the Amar Rava, Yisrael Mumar, Ochel Nevelot L'Teavon. If you have a Yisrael like this, who's basically doesn't care so much about halacha, will take the easy way out, turning out to Amabet, but he wants to slaughter. Bodek Sakim V'Notein Lo. Okay, so we have a Mumar like this, a Jew. He's sitting in front of us, or she's sitting in front of us. We want them to slaughter our meat. Okay, let's say they know how to slaughter, we don't. So we check the knife before. Because remember, if the knife has a nick in it, right, it could kill the animal before we actually do the kosher slaughtering, and then it will turn the animal into a treifa, ruin the animal. So what do? We check the knife, because umutar le'echol mishchitato, and then it's completely permitted to do a shchita, because we assume he did it right, and that's, why do it wrong if you could do it right? If I already checked the knife, and all he has to do is slaughter the animal, should be, pretty obvious. He's not going to mess it up. Aval lo badak v'natan lo yishchot. Now, what if we didn't check, and we give him the knife? Then, in an ideal world, he shouldn't slaughter right now, okay? He shouldn't slaughter. Ve'im shachad, if he did anyway, we still have a solution, and this is the b'di'evet. So the lechatchila is, you can give this person who's not completely trusted, right, because they'll take the easy way out, as long as you check the knife before. Okay, so if you check the knife before, we can assume the rest of it must have been done properly, because there's no reason to think he would have done it any other way. But if you didn't check the knife, then we're worried that maybe he didn't bother checking the knife. And then what do? Well, there's a pretty easy solution. So don't let him do it without checking the knife. That's where we get into the world of post facto. Don't let him do it if we didn't check the knife, because we don't know. But because we can't assume that this mumar is going to check their own knife. However, im shachat, if already you come in and it's slaughtered and it's done, you didn't have a chance to check the knife, bodek sakino acharab, you check the knife after, right? What's the concern with the nick? That maybe it got a nick while you were slaughtering the animal. Now, it can't have a nick and then the nick will go away. So therefore, nimtzeit sakino yafa mutar lecho mishchitato. If when you check the knife after the shchita and the knife is totally fine, then you can assume that the slaughtering was done properly, because again, the knife was fine, because if it's fine now, it was for sure fine before, and we assume that the rest of it he must have done properly. V'im lav, but if the knife happens to have a nick in it, now there's two possibilities. It could have gotten a nick during the slaughtering, which would have been okay, right? Like once he was already cut the simanim, and then it got a nick. So you can't use it next time. And then, but this shchita would be fine, but you don't know. Maybe it had a nick before because nobody checked it, and you can't assume that the mumar checked their knife. So therefore, if it had a nick, then asur lecho mishchitato. So then you can't eat it. So that's the b'di'evet. The b'di'evet is, if you check the knife after and it was fine, then you can eat the meat. Chutz, keep going in the Mishnah now. Chutz mecheresh shotev katan dafilu di'evet nami lo. Right, we're not going to rely on them even post facto. Shema yeshu, shema yidratzu, v'shema yachlidu. Maybe they'll mess up the shchita. V'kulan sheshtachatu ahaya. But back to square one. How are we going to explain this question? And all of these people, if someone was watching them, it's okay. Every time we're going to say the same question. Alakai, it's just referring to the previous line. The language doesn't make sense. How could you say v'kulan? It should have said v'im. Ela Yisrael Mumar. If it's Yisrael Mumar, well, it shouldn't matter if someone was watching, because watching doesn't help. Remember, it all depends on did you check the knife or not check the knife. If you check the knife and gave it to him or her, then we already said that person can slaughter it, ab initio. Ela shelo badak, and if you didn't check, well, then it doesn't help you. Right? right? It has nothing to do with her people watching the slaughtering. It all just matters, did you check the knife after? If you check the knife after, then it's fine. If you, again, post facto, we'll accept the slaughtering. If you check the knife and it's not fine, then we don't accept it. So this has absolutely nothing to do with somebody watching. Somebody watching doesn't help. Watching is watching them slaughter, not checking the knife. And therefore, right, so, right, and if you don't even have the knife to check, it certainly doesn't help the people watched. Maybe he slaughtered it with a defective knife. So, kasha. Okay, this line cannot be explained according to Ravashi. Okay. Now moving on to Ravina. Okay, so again, to just summarize, because those three are a bit of a threesome here. So now we're going to say like this. We have three opinions that basically talk about this person, either a kuti, where a Jew is either watching the whole time, or a Jew is coming and going, that will say, ideally you can accept it, or Yisrael Mumar, that somebody checked the knife before. And then we have the issue of, what's the b'di'evet? The b'di'evet with the kuti is Yotzei v'nichnas in the first, or it was done without anyone there. And with Ravashi, it was no one checked the knife before and we checked the knife after. So if the knife is checked, we can assume it was good. Okay, we're not worried, Shem Yishu, Shem Yishu, Shem Yachlidu, because again, we said, I see your question, Gita, we're not worried. That's because what I said, this Yisrael Mumar, we're assuming just takes the easy way out, right? If they're going to not keep halacha, it's because it's an easier method. To slaughter correctly or not correctly is all one and the same. In other words, they know the halacha, they just don't care about keeping it when it's inconvenient for them. But once they're slaughtering, we assume they're going to do it the way they're supposed to. Okay, and with the kuti, right, if the kuti is willing to eat it, then we're not worried about those things either. Okay, so now we're going to go to Ravina. And Ravina, there's two versions of what Ravina holds. So the first is Hachi Katane. Ravina Amar Hachi Katane. Hakol Shochatin means Hakol Mumchim Shochatin. All those who are experts in Hilchot Shchita are allowed to slaughter. Mumchin v'af al pi she'ein muchzakin. This means if you're a mumche, even though you haven't practiced, okay, you don't have a track record that you've done shchita many times, okay, but you are a mumche. We know that you know the halacha. B'ameh dvarim amurim. So what does this mean exactly? Okay, they're really explaining to you what I just did, which is what does it mean to be a mumche? Sheyodim bo sheyodei lomar rochot shchita. Okay, we know he knows the laws of shchita. Aval. But if we don't know, now maybe you do know Hilchot Shchita, but we don't know that you know Hilchot Shchita, so we can't let you do Shchita ab initio. Okay, now we're up to the next line. You can't do Shchita ab initio because we don't know if you know the halachas or not. Ve'im shachat, what if you did anyway? So what do? We give you a test when you're done. Bodkinoto, we give you a test, and im yodea lomar Hilchot Shchita, mutar lechom shchitato. If after you slaughter we give you a test and we see that you know the laws of shchita, then great. Ve'im lav asur lechom shchitato. But if you don't pass the test, then we can't eat from your shchita. Chutz, okay, going now to the next line. Chutz mechere shotev katan dafilu di'evet namilo. Shema yeshu, shema yidresu, v'shema yachlidu. Again, don't accept any of these people because maybe they'll mess up the shchita. V'kulan sheshachatu ahaya, back to our question that we ask each time, to what's it referring? Right, it's referring back previously, and you should say im shachato and not v'kulan. Ela she'em mumchin, if we're talking about our case, if they're not a mumche, bibodkino tosalge, it's enough to just ask him questions, or ask her questions, do you know the laws of shchita? You don't need to have somebody watching them, so the somebody watching makes no sense here. To which they answer, very similar to what they answered to Raba bar Ulla, delete kaman delivdike. They're not here anymore for us to ask them if they know the laws of shchita. In that case, we can say if someone was watching their shchita and saw that they didn't wait in between, or they didn't put the knife in the wrong way, or something that they, and saw that the shchita was proper, then we can accept their shchita. So again, from an ideal sense, if we don't know anything about you, you come over and you decide to slaughter, and we have no idea, we don't know who you are, you came from a different town, and we don't recognize you, and we don't know, do you know the laws of shchita? We should not allow you to do a shchita lechatchila. But, and if you do know, then great. But if you did, then we have to ask you. If we can't ask you because you disappeared after that, you slaughtered the meat, left, then we can eat the meat if someone was watching you. And those are the two b'diavad cases mentioned in the Mishnah. Okay, so we have a solution according to this. Next option, Ika d'amrei. But some people say that Ravina actually said something else. Okay, why is this something else? Because Ravina is going to have a mildly different version according to this. So let's see in the chart. Ravina Amal, Hachi Katane, Hakol Shochatin, Hakol Muchzakim Shochatin. Instead of the Mumchim now, we're going to say Muchzak. Right? There we said Muchzak, we said Mumche B'na Muchzak. Now we're going to do Muchzak B'na Mumche. What does that mean? This person is slaughtered a few times. We know that. But we don't know that they actually know the laws of Shechita. So, Hakol Muchzakim Shochatin. Right, that's who we're referring to. So, what's the case exactly? What's the whole concern? We're worried if you didn't practice, you might faint. It's very well that you know the laws of Shechita. It doesn't mean that you're not going to faint when you're slaughtering. So if someone slaughtered 2 or 3 times, remember there's a big machloket in halacha. What is chazaka? Is chazaka 2 times or 3 times? But without getting into it, they mention both here. And you didn't faint. But if you haven't done that yet, we don't allow you because you might faint. Now, if you did it, right, you haven't done it 2 or 3 times, but you haven't to slaughter the meat, and you said, listen, I know I didn't faint, then we'll accept it. Again, post facto. That's the shchita tok shera. Okay. Again, we're not going to accept those 3 because maybe they made a mistake and didn't know all the laws, right? Or can't even tell us whether they did or not, because we don't accept they're not knowledgeable. They don't have that. Now, what's that last line referring to? Right? They would be referring to the last line. It should say, Ve'im shachato. Ella ashe'en muchzakin. If we say it's talking about the ein muchzakin, if you haven't done it 2 or 3 times, v'hamar bebari lisage. We already said as long as they tell us, I know I didn't faint, that's fine. So what do you need someone watching them? That's not what's needed. So which they answered, just like with the other 2, delete kaman de l'shayle. Okay, so both for Raba bar Ulla and Ravina in the 2 versions of Ravina, basically we're going to assume the person is no longer there. In this case, to ask them, right? In the previous case, it was to quiz them. And in the previous case, it was to say, do you know you didn't touch the meat because you were tamei? So in all these 3 cases, the person is not there for us to ask the questions. And therefore, we're going to accept it, b'diavad, if someone was watching them. If someone was watching them, that will resolve the problem. Okay, now we're going to start going through. Okay, and this is the left part of the chart. Why didn't everyone agree with the other opinions? So we're going to go in a weird kind of order. Ravina v'Raba bar Ulla ka'Abaye v'Rava v'Rav Ashi lo amrei. So the first category is those 3 in the middle. Abaye, Rava, and Rav Ashi, who each say it was either a kuti or a mumar, or a Jew who doesn't keep halacha so much, right? All the 3 of these opinions are kind of similar. Mishum de kashilu v'kulan. Now, in what way were they the most similar? No, neither of them had an interpretation for how to read this line. V'kulan shechatu v'achayim ro'inotam shchitatan kshera. So therefore, Raba, Ulla, and Ravina, according to both versions, didn't agree with them because they're left with a difficulty. Okay, kulu kiraba bar Ulla lo amrei. Now, if you remember, we had these problems. Why does tamei b'mukdashin appear here, according to him, when its real place is in zvachim? And then we said, either the real place was in Zvachim and here it just got mentioned, or the real place is here and it just got mentioned there. So we had 2 possible answers and these were 2 versions. So now we're going to give, according to each version of that answer, we're going to say like this. Lahach lishana da'amart hachi ikar. According to the one who answered there, here is its main place. And in Zvachim it was just mentioned because they were mentioning other people. Adraba. They basically said, no, I don't agree with that. Hatam ikar debekadshim kai. They basically say that's a weak answer because obviously mukdashim, sanctified things, the central issue is in Zvachim and there's absolutely no reason to mention it here. Lahach lishana da'amart hatam ikar, the one who says that there was the central place, v'hachad aide detane tamei b'chulin tane nami tamei b'mukdashin, and here we just mentioned it because we were talking about tamei b'chulin, we mentioned tamei b'mukdashin. They could answer, okay, again, we're putting words in the mouth of Abaye, Rava, Ravashi, and Ravina. Why did they think this was a weak answer? Because they could say, Tamei b'chulin gufalo itzrichale. You don't even need the main case here of Tamei b'chulin, shenasu tarat kodesh. Why? Now remember, what did we say when we've learned this opinion? That chulin shenasu tarat kodesh, in order to say we're talking about a Tamei who's dealing with chulin shenasu tarat kodesh, and they could slaughter it anyway because we're not worried they're going to touch, is because this person, Rabba Bar Ulla, must hold that chulin shenasu al tarat kodesh are like kodesh. So now we're going to say the people who disagree, all these 5 people, are going to say like this: who even needs to mention tamei with chulin shenasu al tarat kodesh? That shchita is okay, even ab initio, because lo yitzrichale, you don't need that, because chulin shenasu al tarat kodesh lavke kodesh dami. They don't think if I decide I'm going to treat my chulin like kodesh, no real roots of kodesh apply to it. Okay, again, this is the debate. So they're on the other side of that debate, and they don't treat it like that, which means if the main Tamei b'mukdashin sugya is in Zvachim, there's 0 point to mention it here, not Tamei b'mukdashin, and not even Tamei b'mukdashin here is because of Tamei b'chulin, shenasu al tarat kodesh. But chulin shenasu al tarat kodesh, there's no point to tell me their shchita is good. Of course the shchita is good. We don't even really treat it as kodesh. So those are 2 answers to why they don't agree with Rabba Bar Ulla. Okay, next one. Kulu ke Ravina lo amri. Now we're jumping down to Ravina. Why don't they hold like Ravina number 1, who talked about the mumchim? Lahachli shana damar mumchin in, the one who's, right, the first language, the first version, which said mumchin, she'e mumchin lo, if they're not mumchim not, basically they all disagreed because what they say, rov mitzuyin etzel shchita mumchin heim. Okay, now what does this mean? It doesn't mean most people know how to slaughter properly. But what do we say? Anyone who's going to go and slaughter an animal must be a mumche. Okay? Who would go slaughter an animal if they don't really know the laws of shchita? We're assuming the majority of slaughterers that exist in the country and wherever are mumchim. So there's no reason to talk about mumchim and not mumchim if you don't know if he's a mumche. If you don't know he or she is a mumche, but they're slaughtering, we can assume they're a mumche. And therefore, even ideally, ab initio, they can do it. Okay, second language of Ravina, why don't they hold by him? Lahachli shana damar muchzakin in she'em muchzakin lo. Remember, what was his concern? If you're not muchzak, if you don't have experience, we're worried you're going to faint. Okay, la lufe lo cheshinan. They're not worried about fainting. Okay, that's a concern he has. We're not concerned about that. Okay, now we have to go back to Rava and Abaye and Ravashi. So now we're going to go Rava lo amar ka Abaye kikushi. Okay, Rava, we know didn't hold like Abaye when the Israel is standing there the whole time. Because Rava says, even if he's Yotzev Nechnas, remember he brought that Mishna and said coming and going is sufficient. Abaye lo amar ka Rava, hatam lo naga hacha naga. Now we're going to distinguish between the cases. Why didn't Abaye think, okay, Abaye heard the same Mishnah, he knew the Mishnah of Avodah Zarah, why did he think that there it's enough to be Yotzev Nechnas, and in our case it's not? Because in the case of the wine, there's no reason to think that the person touched the wine. So they just left them in the store. The concern is, did they touch, did they not touch? Here, the kuti touched it and dealt with it and slaughtered it. So there's all the more concern that if nobody's watching, it might not have been done properly. And therefore, Abaye says, if Yotzev Nechnas, we're not going to allow it ab initio. Rav Ashi lo amar kitravayhu. Now we're going to put Abaye and Rav into one group because they're both talking about kutim. Why did Rav Ashi switch it to a Yisrael Mumar? Why didn't he take the kuti example? Because, remember what we said, in order to use this kuti as a case, you have to believe that kuti were true converts. And we're going to say that according to Rav Ashi, Kasavar, he must have held kutim gerei arayoten. Okay, they were forced converts. They're not really true converts. Abaye lo amar ke Rav Ashi. Why didn't he say about this mumar thing? Lo sfira laha de Rava. Because he doesn't hold. Remember, we said that the whole thing of Rav Ashi is based on the statement of Rava that a mumar, as long as you check the knife, it's okay, right? It works. So Abaye just doesn't hold like that. He doesn't think that you can let a mumar do a shchita. He doesn't trust a mumar. Ela Rava. Now, last question for today. We're going to end here. Rava, my time alor kashmate. No, why? Now we're going to have like I call it the ringer at the end, the surprise. Why didn't Rava hold like his own opinion? I kind of made reference to this before. Why didn't Rava say like Rav Ashi? It was Yisrael Mumar, and it fits perfectly, it's consistent with his opinion. So that's a really good question. To which we answer, surprise, surprise, lidvarav de Abaye kamar v'leilo svirale. When Rava said it's a kuti, kish Yisrael yotzev v'nechnatz, when the Jew is coming and going, all he was doing was correcting Abaye and saying, Abaye, if you want to say it's a kuti, when the Jew is standing there, at least say it's when the Jew comes and goes. He doesn't have to be standing there. As long as there's a Jew coming and going, it's enough to rely on the kuti. But Rava actually doesn't hold that way. Rava, we're now going to claim, holds like Rav Ashi, which fits perfectly with Rava's opinion, that if you have a mumar and just eats non-kosher because it's convenient, if the Israel check the knife, we can rely on that person's shchita. And that Rava really holds that way. And when Rava said, it was only saying, Abai, at least correct yourself and say this if you're going to say what you're saying. But it's not really Rava's opinion. Okay, which sort of a little bit makes it like we maybe only have 5 opinions, right? And it's just a minor variation of Abayi's. So in the end, what did we do today? Okay, the next thing was a braita. I'm not going to start it now, but it's a braita that basically continues into the next page. And then we're going to show how Abayi gets his opinion from there, and Rava gets his opinion from there, and basically shows how each one got to this, again, not the Rava real Shita, but the Rava Shita that we just claimed. We don't really know. This is all the Gemara talking. Maybe Rava had his own Shita about Yisrael Yotzev Nechnas, or maybe that was just the way he kind of corrected Abayi. Okay, but either way, we have 6 ways of reading this Mishnah. As I said in the beginning, that just shows how complicated this Mishnah was and how hard it was to understand what exactly it was talking about. And the Gemara is cognizant of this and raises all the difficulties at the end. Where are all the weak points, which is really all they were doing, where are all the weak points in each of these arguments, and which explains why each one came up with their own solution, even though each solution was weak, right? If there was a good solution, then there would have been one answer, and that would have been an easy way to read the Mishnah. So with that, it might be a bit of a confusing way to start our Gemara, our Masechet, because we now have 6 different ways of reading this Mishnah, but it is an interesting exercise in trying to read different ways of reading something and then raising what are the difficulties in reading it in that manner. With that, we finish for today. Wishing everyone a good day and a Shavua Tov.